Hello, my name is Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about passion, purpose, and the human experience. Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with the generous support of the Wyoming Community Foundation. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to two journalists from the Wyoming Tribune Eagle, located in Cheyenne, Wyoming, Niki Kottmann and Hannah Black. Their story and research is made possible by a grant from Wyoming Humanities. This grant is part of our democracy initiative. It's called Why It Matters, Civic and Electoral Participation. Welcome, Niki and Hannah. Thank you for joining. And I know two busy journalists, so I'm lucky to have you on. Thank you so much. So I want you each, in your own words, to describe the story you wrote, the research you did, and why you chose this story.
I guess to kind of start with why we chose the story, I think it was more of a newsroom-wide sort of decision that we came to when thinking about, what are the biggest issues that we feel like, are related to governmental participation, voting, people being heard within, city council, the school board, those elected leadership positions. And we Cheyenne is, much like Wyoming, is mostly white, but, there is a Latinx, Hispanic, and Black population here. And we'd kind of heard from leaders, as had our predecessors throughout the years that, those groups did not feel as included in the, civic process. And so we wanted to kind of step back and look at that and talk to some of the leaders in, the NAACP chapter here. We have several other, immigrants' rights organizations and, just other community organizing efforts where those, minorities are more represented than, say, your governmental body. And so we wanted to reach out to those leaders and ask, do you feel heard by Cheyenne's elected leaders? And, if not, why? And I think as we started to reach out to those people, the overwhelming answer we heard from most people was no. And we feel like we have some concrete ideas, these people were saying to us, we have some ideas about how we could kind of improve that communication. But I don't know, Niki, do you want to kind of take it from there?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it kind of evolved pretty organically out of a few different conversations that we had with our colleagues who are also working on the project. So we knew kind of broadly that we wanted to talk about representation, but what kind of happened was it kind of broke into two stories. One story that was really honing in on two specific representatives or people of color in the community who were trying to run for office. But then Hannah and I wanted to take a step back and kind of look at more of a broad perspective at kind of what does representation actually mean in general, but particularly to people of color, of course. And then what does that actually do to the community when you don't have, for example, any Black individual on city council or the city commission or the school board? We do have at least one non-white member of our city council, but that's all that, of the elected leadership in our city that we've been able to find so far. And we felt like, even if there is a small minority population, they still deserve to be represented. But we needed to hear that in their own words. Why is that important? And kind of what issues aren't being addressed if we don't have minority representation from elected leadership?
And what did you discover in terms of the lack of minority leadership? Is it that they want to participate, but they don't feel welcome in participating?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we've been really careful about was, we went into this project with assumptions, I think as anybody has, but we wanted to obviously ask a lot of questions and make sure that we weren't, we weren't thinking of it the wrong way. We wanted to, obviously talk to these community leaders and, ask them, do you want this type of representation? And if so, why? Why is it important? And so I think what we really found was people, and I think this is a historic thing throughout this country where, Black individuals or Hispanic, Latinx individuals, there isn't necessarily an innate trust in, say an all-white city council, or maybe not an outright mistrust, but I haven't seen them work for me. I don't, what's the point of going to them for, trash cleanup on my street or something if, I just don't feel like they're going to listen to me anyway. Or I heard my friend tried to go to somebody on the city council and, they just were shut down or ignored, and then it becomes a community thing of like, well, we're going to look inward and use our own organizations to try and solve these issues. But then, there's that can be detrimental if, anything like that. And it just sort of becomes this vicious cycle of, for whatever reason, people, obviously it was, more racism, obviously, in decades past and still can be, can't get elected to certain offices. And then I think that just reinforces itself. People think, why would I even try to run if, my community is so small, only 2% of people here identify as Black, if I can't count on support from the white community, what's the point of running? And so then it just becomes a vicious cycle of you can't get anybody into power. And I think that's really what we heard from those people and about some of those efforts to still try and recruit people anyway.
What did you discover and learn in your research that really struck a chord, maybe a personal chord with how can we do things differently?
Mm-hmm. I think it's how we think about representation, especially as white members of the community. I think it was important for Hannah and I, both as white identifying women, to go into this knowing like we have our own idea or definition of what representation means. And we have put in some work to try to understand that, but then we had to put in even more work to understand what that means specifically for people in our community. I think especially last summer after all of the protests, Black Lives Matter protests, I think there are more and more people kind of challenging themselves to do more reading or just to kind of better themselves and better their understanding of what it is like to be a person of color in this in America right now, even though as a white person, you'll never fully understand, of course. But I think we had to take a step further and think, okay, well, we're also not from here. Hannah and I are not from Wyoming or from Cheyenne. We've only been here for a little while. And so we kind of had to kind of really just go into it thinking, okay, we can't have any preconceived notions. We have to go in with a completely open mind and just make sure that we are really listening to the people of color in our community, but also give a shot to one or two white members of the community to kind of get a sense of the full picture. And what we ended up doing in that regard was talking to a white man on our city council who had been brought up in some of our interviews with people of color as a person who they did trust, or as somebody who had helped with some issues. And when I say issues, I think it's important to clarify. We kind of went into this noting like, that there are some sort of quote unquote minority issues or even nationally issues that disproportionately affect people of color. But I think both Hannah and I kind of had this eureka moment realizing that this isn't really a story about minority issues. It's about everyday issues that anyone could be facing in their neighborhood. But the barrier here is that if you're a person of color, it's harder to get those issues addressed often, because whether that's because you feel like you don't have any sort of connection to your city council member, if they're not reaching out to you, if you've never met them, something that came up in our research was some of our sources saying, we don't have anyone coming to knock on our doors. There's no city council people coming to introduce themselves. So how, they might not even know who their representative is. They'd have to do research to figure that out. And so it was an interesting kind of back and forth kind of figuring out, that white man on city council who we spoke to, for example, was saying, people just need to speak up. If there's an issue, I'll listen, just speak up. But speaking up is easier said than done from our understanding, especially after all this reporting.
Do you think that people feel ostracized if they do speak up? Do you think they feel intimidated, for example?
I think that could be part of it. I think there's a fear of being ignored, or just like why should, if they haven't reached out to me, they're my city leaders, why should I feel like they're, I guess to sort of clarify that, there's a, part of Cheyenne on the south side that I guess historically has had fewer resources dedicated to it by the city. And the residents who live there are, a lot of people are lower income, and a lot of people that live in that area are Hispanic or other people of color. And I think there's been, whether it's been intentional or not, maybe it started that way. I certainly don't want to say that today's, leaders are purposefully, overlooking certain areas of the city, because we don't know that for sure. But I think historically there's just been less resources dedicated to that area. And so when people are living in that area, or just, in maybe some of the lesser developed areas of town, they maybe feel a little bit more disconnected from anybody who would be making decisions for that area, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And that disconnect kind of comes into one theme that popped up that we didn't really expect, was sort of status, and how there can be there are definitely different quote unquote statuses or like levels of connectivity among people even within the same background. Like, we talked to several Black individuals who said because they were very involved in their community, they actually felt like they had a connection with their elected leaders. Like, for example, one of my sources works with the VA, and he's very he talks to our governor several times a year. He knows him personally. Same with local leadership, knows them very well just because of the nature of his work. He's also a retired airman. So for example, he very outright said, I recognize that I kind of have even some more privilege than some of my neighbors, even because I'm in this position within my own community where I'm forced to interact with these individuals more. So I've gotten to know them better. So I know that they'll listen to me because they respect me through the work that I do every day and have been doing for a few decades now. But he was saying he recognizes that many members of his community who also identify as Black individuals here in Cheyenne might not feel as connected because, just because of the nature of their own jobs. And if they don't work with as many people in quote unquote higher status or people who are closer to elected leaders, whether they're elected leaders themselves or being in a place like Wyoming, everyone kind of knows everyone or has some connection to people. So, if he was, his neighbor might not, be working for the governor, but he could work for someone who is related to the governor, and that would still make them more connected to their leaders. So it kind of just depends on, what you're also doing for a living. And so we had a lot of very interesting conversations about that and kind of how quote unquote status within your community is at play there.
I think also, if I could just add something really quickly that I found in a couple of my interviews was a recognition that, for example, I talked to a former elementary school principal who now is the vice president of the Wyoming Independent Citizens Coalition, and they do work to try and speak out against inequities in the state and assist individuals with issues they're having along those lines. And she said, I used to do this thing where I feel like we always assume we know what the people on, living on the South Side want or need, and not often enough do we ask them. And that was a big point that she made. And kind of going along with that was a recognition of, maybe we should be making our meetings, our, school board meetings, city council meetings, commissioners meetings, whatever, more accessible to people who work all day or have several kids that, when they get home from work, they need to feed those kids. And it's just the last thing on their list, if it's even registered, to make their voice heard about, some issue that maybe they're concerned about in the city, but it's just not, it doesn't rise to the level of being able to, cancel other things on their schedule or get a babysitter or anything like that to, go speak out. And I think, it is easy for elected leaders to say, my door is open, I would love to hear from you. But I think when you're in those positions, what I've been hearing is that people want more of an effort for their leaders that have been elected to kind of go to them because, they're just, even with, people that non-people of color, I think anybody, especially if they're low income, is going to have a difficult time really getting that in their schedule to go to a government meeting or interact with an official like that.
So it sounds like accessibility happens on a couple of different levels. It sounds like accessibility isn't just that you can call your local mayor or people in town council or your local representatives, but the conversation on accessibility is more about office hours. If you work 9 to 5 and they work 9 to 5 or whatever, and you are picking up your kids and you're going to soccer practice or you're running home to make dinner, or maybe you work 2 jobs or 3 jobs even, then where is your accessibility point? Because that's where people become unreachable.
Absolutely. And it's kind of interesting too, I won't talk too much about this because it's very fascinating, easy to get off on a tangent about, but something that came up too is how, because there are so few people of color here in Cheyenne, that means that those communities, it's harder. It's almost, you'd think it would make it easier for them to be more tight knit, but actually several of our sources said the opposite, especially for the Black community. There's a history there of church playing such a huge role as a community gathering place. And we learned that the Black churches in Cheyenne are actually really struggling with membership. They don't have very high attendance. There are a few of them. There's not just one, but still they have kind of been declining and haven't really served as much as a community gathering place as they often have in the past. And I think that's another thing, is we need literal spaces for people to kind of come together and figure out what those issues are that they're, that people that look like them are facing. But like we said earlier, that could mean people of their own family, but also people who don't look like them and who just happen to live in the same neighborhood. Like one of my sources brought up how there was just a big issue in her neighborhood of abandoned houses being places where people were, drug addicts were using to shoot up heroin. And that was, you don't want to have your neighborhood, you don't want to find needles all around your neighborhood. That's not good for anyone, especially for the children living there. So she was saying how that was an issue that was affecting everyone and not just her and the one or two other Black individuals in her neighborhood. But she had struggled to kind of figure out what route to go to get that cleaned up. And she did find one white individual on the city council who really helped her. So that was an example of what we were saying earlier about how it's not just quote unquote minority issues. These are just issues that could affect anyone, but they often, just happen to be happening in these neighborhoods.
Well, I think in your story and, because you're journalists, how do you develop trust with people to open up to you to really, explore a story?
Yeah, I mean, I think with things like this, especially because we are white reporters going into a story that we knew was going to deal with race and talking to largely people of color, for me, I try to make it clear that I'm going in with an open mind and that I just want people to tell me about their experiences and that I'm genuinely curious about, these things. And I think I try to be as kind of as sensitive as possible. But I also hopefully, give people room to correct me. And I think I try to, generally in all of my interviews come off as personable and open to learning. And I think that hopefully that has really facilitated good answers, good discussions. I've certainly learned a lot just from people who have different backgrounds and have different perspectives because, they've lived in Cheyenne their whole lives or, they are Black or Hispanic. And I think I really just try to express that I am, I am curious and want to know about what they think and that I want to do my best to correctly convey, what they're saying to me. And I'm doing my best to get the story right. And that's one of the most important things to me. And I feel like I've been able to establish that trust. We've re-interviewed some of these people, and I think those bonds just kind of get stronger when you talk to people in your own community multiple times. And and I think it's a learning experience, but I think it's really just about going in and expressing that you are there to learn.
Mm-hmm. And we also had kind of an advantage going into this because I think it's fair to say that not a lot of these types of stories have already been written in our area. So a lot of people who we were contacting were kind of pleasantly surprised. Like I know I had a few people actually thank me for the fact that we were actually just even pursuing this kind of story in the first place. So I think that kind of motivated us to keep going and to take the same approach of just being, like Hannah said, really open. And but I think it's also tricky as journalists. We have to walk that line of like being really sensitive, but also knowing when to maybe not push back is the right word, but to kind of push people to explain things a little bit further or to maybe question why they might have felt a certain way in a certain moment. Because I know I'm in charge of our social media for the paper, for example. So I'm always already thinking one step ahead, like what are the things that people are going to kind of get upset about in the comments or, and obviously our reporting isn't driven by that, but it's just one thing that I think about is even more so from a point of view of like people who might read the story and have more questions and might not understand because primarily our readership is white. That makes complete sense. It's primarily a white city. So we just wanted to make sure that we were covering all of our bases and kind of being as specific as possible and giving as many concrete examples as possible so our readers could really understand where these people were coming from.
You two have done an excellent job. I love hearing this. And Hannah, tell me, how long have you lived in Cheyenne and where did you grow up?
So I moved to Cheyenne in October, actually. So I've only been here about, I guess, 6-ish months. And I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. And then my first job out of college was in Minneapolis. And I was there for 2 years and then came from there to here. So been, kind of moving around, but certainly haven't lived in a place like Cheyenne before. So it's definitely been a learning experience to understand, the city dynamics and an adjustment. But, I've really enjoyed my time here so far.
And how about you, Niki?
Yeah, I'm originally from the Chicago suburbs, but I moved here in 2019, actually from Sarasota, Florida. I lived there for 3 years working at a paper down there after college. So I've kind of been all over the place a little bit. But yeah, same as Hannah. I actually had never even stepped foot in Wyoming before moving here. So I definitely had a lot to learn. I had spent a lot of time in Colorado, but obviously they're still very different places, even though Cheyenne's right over the border from Colorado. But it's been a good place to kind of challenge ourselves as reporters.
That's great. And it has been so wonderful talking to the two of you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.